first 10 customers as a founder, the pricing is not that important. If you can convince people to pay you something, that's the most important thing. Really, the goal there is to get people using your product to the point where they feel like it's indispensable. And that, more than your revenue, is what's going to demonstrate product market fit to your next round of investors. When I look at successful startups, they built something that was better, which is how they've accelerated and gotten a lot of traction. When pitching CISOs or executives, is you always want to set up the problem, but doing it in a compelling way, but doing it with the right level of detail where it's like actually contributing a novel piece of information to the CISO. I think that's the key.
So Eli, thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So just as a reminder for the people watching this, my name's Tobias. I'm a principal here at Primary, do a lot of cyber investing for the firm. We're New York's biggest seed fund with around $1 billion under management. And we're talking with folks like Eli who know a lot about what it means to sell cyber products into CISOs and security teams. And so maybe to start, just give a little bit of an introduction on your story. You've done a lot of really interesting things in the cyber world across your career. So it'd be great to get to know you a little bit and hear what you've done.
Sure. Yep. Everyone, thanks for listening. Yeah, my name is Ely Kahn. So let's see here. My career starts in the U.S. federal government and intelligence community. I started my career there doing cybersecurity first at the Department of Homeland Security and then at the White House, working for the National Security Advisor on cyber policy and strategy. After about a decade in D.C., I spun out and went off to business school and started a company during my second year of business school called Sqrrl. And I started it with 6 engineers out of the NSA, the National Security Agency. And they really built out NSA's big data platform. So post 9/11, Patriot Act world, NSA slurping up petabytes of data on a daily basis. We've all read about it via the Snowden disclosures. And the NSA needed a highly scalable data platform to store the data and also look for interesting linkages in the data. And the folks at the NSA that I started Sqrrl with really were the ones that built out that big data platform. At the centerpiece of it was a highly scalable graph database. And so Sqrrl, we took that graph database capability and built out what we called a threat hunting platform. We didn't invent the term threat hunting, but we probably did more to popularize it and commercialize it than anyone. And we're also one of the first folks to really apply the concept of knowledge graphs to the security space. This is back in 2012, 13, 14. Sqrrl, we had a good 5-year run and ultimately were acquired by AWS. Sqrrl became Amazon Detective, one of the AWS security products. And then I started another security product called AWS Security Hub, which was AWS's cloud security posture management tool. After about 4 years there, taking Security Hub 0 to 1 and scaling it up to 35,000 or so customers, decided to branch out again and joined SentinelOne to become their product lead for cloud security. Since I've been there for 2 years now, roles expanded first to their AI platform and now leading all of product at SentinelOne.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. So this conversation is really geared around helping founders who are building security companies think through how to sell to CISOs. And I'm curious, the security landscape has evolved a lot in the time from when you started Sqrrl to now. I'm wondering, what are the big things that have changed in terms of what founders need to do to sell effectively? What are some things that you did effectively at Sqrrl that might not work today or vice versa?
Yeah. Well, I think, there's certainly been an explosion of new security startups, although I'd argue that the security space has always had a lot of startups relative to the larger startup ecosystem. It's been a place that has cultivated startups because there's lots of acquirers there and lots of problems to solve, lots of tough problems to solve with technology. So the things that we were doing at Sqrrl, I think, are generally still quite effective now. One thing was just inherent to the nature of the company. We were one of the first companies that spun out of the U.S. intelligence community. It's sort of become a little bit more commonplace now.
Yeah.
There's like you can basically build a bingo board in terms of which intelligence company a startup has its roots in, whether it be a US-based one or Israeli one or some other country. But it was a very unique story at the time. So we got a lot of press around that. Company spins out NSA is an interesting headline. But to generalize it, it's like really coming up like, what is your unique story that helps you stand out from the crowd? And really, building a theme around it, building a storyline around it that, can get you meetings with CISOs. CISOs are bombarded with meetings with startup requests. So, they're really taking meetings where they think the startup has something unique to tell them, has a unique story to tell them, and educate them about something new that they don't really know about yet. So that's one. The other like really effective approach we had to getting time with CISOs is somewhat related, but we really heavily invested in technical marketing. Our goal was no marketing fluff, and we were building marketing materials that would really appeal to like a highly technical security engineer. We always said, okay, what is a marketing artifact that would get like a Goldman Sachs security engineer or threat analyst, threat hunter to download it? And that's like what we focused on. So, we came up with this concept of threat hunting, which no one was really using yet. And we built out, a lot of the seminal materials about how to threat hunt. We built out a threat hunting maturity model. We built out a threat hunting framework. We gathered a bunch of who we considered to be the best threat hunters in the space. And these weren't like super senior, well-known people, but just generally regarded in the space as being technical subject matter experts. And we put together a compendium of articles that they authored and sort of gave them a bit of a spotlight. For each of these articles, we syndicated them into webinars, into blog posts. And honestly, the traction we got around this technical marketing was really what got us on the map. Like we made a name for ourselves around what is threat hunting, how to do it, and it was different. It was a different story than what everyone else was telling. It was a novel story. So being able to tell that novel story, I think, is honestly the thing that elevates you as a startup founder to like getting CISO mindshare.
It's interesting, sort of, you talk about threat hunting not being a well-established category at the time that you started Sqrrl, and kind of like creating a market around threat hunting. So often I talk to founders of security businesses who are kind of like caught in this tension between trying to like create a market and create a category versus just like aligning themselves with like a Gartner, acronym. Like, do I follow the CSPM hype? Do I follow the DSPM hype? Because there's already stuff that Gartner is writing about those categories, and CISOs might already be kind of looking for solutions in that area. How do you sort of like think about that trade-off of like, I can create a category and do something that might require more market education that CISOs might not already be primed for, or attach myself with a trend that requires less education, but that might be more competitive?
Yeah. There's definitely multiple paths to success here. One is not necessarily better than the other. When I look at successful startups, there are some startups that entered an established space. There were already a lot of startups out there, and they just built something that was better. Wiz is a great example of that.
Yeah.
There were plenty of CSPM style startups out in the market. It was arguably a crowded space. Acquisitions had already started. The cloud service providers had their own, and they built something that was better, which is how they've accelerated and gotten a lot of traction. I think another path to being a successful startup is picking a new technology and creating a security layer for it. We're seeing right now an explosion of Gen AI, security for Gen AI or security for LLMs, brand new technology, new attack surface, people using it rapidly, which usually leads to misconfigurations and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And, security startups will always follow. There will be some winners in that space as well. I think the third path is to reinvent an existing category. You have, sort of the next generation SIM vendors out there that are going after, the Splunk market share as they slowly go to die at Cisco. So any of those paths could be successful. The reinvent, the creating the brand new product segment is honestly probably the hardest. It's probably the hardest because, and so I don't know if I necessarily recommend it. It works reasonably well for us, but in order for it to work, you have to heavily invest in education. And we heavily invest in technical marketing, and it's a zero-sum game with startups, right? You have a certain pot of money to invest, and you got to invest it in one way or the other. We kept our sales team relatively small because we decided we're going to more heavily invest in education of the market. We invested more in marketing than we did with sales as a result.
I mean, one thing I'm hearing from all of that is there's a lot of different strategies that can work, but pick a strategy and align the organization around that strategy. It's like the thing that doesn't work is trying to do both at the same time and not really fully being committed to one. Like in the case of Sqrrl, technical marketing approach where there wasn't a huge outbound sales engine, where you designed the org to align with that set of priorities and strategies, which I think is, it sounds obvious, but there's so many startups I talk to where it's like, oh, we're going to try a bottoms up and a top down approach. And this is how we're going to test both. And it's like, if you test both a little bit, neither of them are going to really work.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, laser focus in a startup is what's going to make you successful. I mean, frankly, at Sqrrl, it took us too long to get laser focus. I think we would have had a much bigger exit if we had gotten to laser focus earlier. I mean, when we started out at Sqrrl, we're like, okay, we've got this cool graph database technology coming out of the NSA. What do we do with it? Well, there's all these interesting database companies that were starting up at the time. MongoDB was starting up at the time. DataStax was just sort of getting off the ground. You had Cloudera and Hortonworks getting off the ground. And we're like, okay, there seems to be a business model here where we could go commercialize an open source database and do well. And so we're like, okay, we've got a graph database. We can also be a NoSQL database or a key value store. We could also be a document database. We could also be an Elasticsearch competitor with a full text search focused database. And so actually we ended up doing a little bit of everything, and it almost crushed us.
Right.
We got close. I mean, it was one of those things calling up Silicon Valley Bank. Can we get a quick loan so we can make payroll type thing this week? So spreading our focus too thin almost cost us the company early on. And it wasn't until okay, let's just pick a single use case and let's call that use case threat hunting, and let's get the entire company, our go-to-market motions, including sales and marketing, obviously our product and development motions, all aligned to that singular use case. And then let's go delight. There's a small handful of threat hunters out there. Let's go build something that truly delights that small community. and then build from there. I mean, that was the real key to our success.
Was there like an impetus or like a moment, like a come to Jesus kind of moment where you were like, we just like need to decide or else
Yeah.
we're done?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the not making payroll
Yeah.
was definitely one of them. But it was literally going through sort of a decision or decision options process. Sort of enumerating what are the things we can be, what are the pros and cons and market opportunity, enumerating those, and then deciding on a whiteboard basically one day that okay, threat hunting it is.
Yeah.
Let's go.
So one other thread I want to pull, based on something you said earlier, probably every cyber business that pitches me says something about like our technology is better. Like we have this insight around a way to do vulnerability assessment or attack path mapping or like this or that. That's just like better than what exists in the market. And as an investor, as a buyer, it can just be really hard to like understand when something legitimately is better. And so you said this thing about Wiz, like sometimes people just like come out with better technology. But I'm curious if there's a way for founders to think about like credibly demonstrating that the technology is like actually better in the context of like the buyer hearing that all the time.
Yeah. I mean, there's a number of ways. So with my startup Sqrrl, we had some very strong social proofing, like, okay, this works at NSA scale,
Right.
and we've got the evidence to prove it.
Right.
We also, this was actually work that was done via NSA during the open source process, where they engaged MIT Lincoln Laboratory and did like real benchmarking, database benchmarking, showing that the ingest speeds into this graph database were 10 times anything else that was out there. So we had both sort of social proofing via effectively a customer, a big customer, and also technical analysis from a trusted third-party source. But like I think the key there is that, especially for startups that are attacking an existing space, it can't just be like marginally better.
Right.
It's got to be like 10x better in order to really convince customers that the benefits outweigh the switching costs. So yeah, I mean, I definitely see a number of startups that are nice incremental improvements to what's out there, but like, probably just a feature as opposed to a full product or platform.
Yeah. I mean, this is something we grapple with all the time too. You've been in a SentinelOne, leading product teams where you're also assessing startups in the market all the time, right? I'm curious how you think about this in that context too. Like obviously this, as a founder, you think about this, but as a product leader, you also do in looking what else is out on the market, comparing different solutions. Like what are the things you look for when you're looking externally at solutions too?
So yeah, I mean, there's a handful of really key factors or decision criteria that go into an acquisition. And we've done a few of them at SentinelOne since I've been there. So in general, we're looking for acquisitions, not surprisingly, that fill holes in our current product portfolio that help us increase deal sizes and better compete with our competitors. So, for any, we're essentially coming up with, what is our top 5 acquisition priority list, typically organized around product segments. So these are like the top 5 product segments that we're actively looking for opportunities in. From there, we start developing shortlists. So within that product segment, what do we think are the top 5 companies that meet our specific criteria? And the specific criteria are typically, their feature set. Like, is the feature set aligned to the type of features that we're looking for? Because oftentimes in these product categories, you can have lots of different types of companies. Like a good example is like the application security posture management space. that sort of can mean a lot of different things these days. So
Yeah.
like really parsing through the companies and like, do they have the specific things that we're looking for that we feel best complement our existing platform?
Yep.
For SentinelOne, we're looking for companies that fit within a specific financial profile for the most part. It's unlikely we're going to be doing billion-dollar acquisitions. So there's a lot of companies that are aggressively raising money. Frankly, if once you get to a certain size, you're pricing yourself out of being a viable candidate for us.
Yeah.
So that's sort of just like, table stakes. If it's like too big of a company, we're probably just not going to be seriously looking at it. As we get deeper into the company, we certainly look at the team and whether like we think the team is a good cultural fit relative to our existing team. Do we think that this is someone that we'll enjoy working with, that someone that could be a leader inside the company, someone that we can trust? I mean, we're of course going deeper into the financials as well. We're looking for companies that have relatively low net burn. SentinelOne, maybe like other public companies, or we're paying close attention to our financials. We're judged heavily by the streets in terms of net profitability. So we need to take a close look at that. Like, if a company's burning like $1 million a month, that's going to make it hard for us to swallow. So anyways, those are some of the items.
Cool. Interesting. I want to go back a little bit to the Sqrrl experience. I think there's a bias among a lot of the security founders I speak to around like the CISO being the person they need to target. And, in your description of the go-to-market at Sqrrl, it like really sounds like it wasn't like that. Like there was more of a bottoms-up motion where you were speaking to a more technical security engineer. And I'm curious, like how you think about the bottoms-up versus the top-down motion for security specifically.
Yeah.
And like how founders should think about that. Like some products are just going to be better predisposed to a top-down versus a bottoms-up sale, but I don't really have a framework for how to think about that, and I'm curious if you have thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, so a big factor on bottoms up versus top down is how hard or easy is it for a customer to get up and running with your product. With Sqrrl, this was even though we were acquired by AWS, we were actually built on a Hadoop backend back in the day when Hadoop was cool still. And so, I mean, it was a pretty heavy install process. Best case, it would be like a month to get up and running. So, the actual purchase needed a lot of top-down air cover in order to get up and running. It was also like an expensive purchase. Like we didn't have like a get started with one user option. Like if you're buying, it's a big data product. You're going to be making an all-in decision to push a lot of data into that product. So it was very much top down. But we realized CISOs don't make buying decisions.
Right.
They don't. Certainly, if you have a CISO relationship, it's helpful because they can introduce you to their director of security operations or director of security engineering or director of cloud engineering and get you meetings with the right players, get you in front of the right players. But every CISO I've engaged with is recusing themselves from the actual buying decision. They're taking recommendations from their technical experts on which tool should they purchase out of a set of options. So, we certainly, tried to leverage any CISO relationship that we had or our investors had to get meetings with them and to, hopefully then have them recommend us to their folks. But all of our marketing materials were oriented towards that sort of director of security operations, the senior security engineer in that organization, a senior DFIR analyst, that the technical recommender we always thought was the most important person that we wanted to get excited about. So we pushed out a lot of like technical demo clips that would speak to them, along with sort of these frameworks about how to actually do hunting with like real specific examples of like what good hunts should look like.
Yeah, it's interesting. The CISOs don't make buying decisions is something that CISOs will like tell you like up front. They'll be like, I'm happy to give you feedback. I'm happy to advise. I'm happy to give you like my 2 cents on what you're building. But the reality is like I'm not going to be the person who decides this. I'm going to loop in this person.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a misunderstood thing about selling into security teams or selling security products into technical teams more generally.
Yeah.
Is that the CISO can be a champion and a stakeholder that's involved, but they're not going to like ultimately make the call.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, it's sort of funny, I just got a document to review and someone on our marketing team wrote CISO's buyer guide for CNAP. I'm like, oh,
Right.
no, CISO's buyer guide's like, an oxymoron.
Right.
So yeah, we're fixing that one.
Cool. So you've had an interesting vantage point selling, investing, and buying. One thing that I always ask in these conversations is like, what are some do's and what are some don'ts of security founders who are just getting started, who like find themselves in a meeting where they're selling in some way? That can be, usually I ask this question in the context of like selling a product to a buyer, but I guess it could also be in the context of fundraising too.
Yeah.
Or selling to a potential acquirer. Like what are some things that you've seen work really well? And what are some absolute don'ts where you've seen people just run into classic mistakes?
Yeah. In terms of, maybe I'll start with the don'ts.
Yeah.
Because this one's fresh. This one's fresh for me. It just happened yesterday. I was chatting with a couple of founders, and actually this has happened multiple times. Oftentimes founders fear sharing information. Because I mean, look, there's some legitimate fears out there. People are worried about their ideas being copied. Folks trying to gather competitive intelligence. But we were with a couple of founders, and it was pretty clear that we scheduled this meeting because we were interested in M&A in that space, and they refused to show us a demo. We had like, our VP of engineering on, myself, a handful of other, senior level product and engineering leaders that had scheduled, in 45 minutes to see a demo, and they just refused. It was like really painful. I'm like, okay, then let's end this meeting and
give everyone back the time.
Good luck. I've even had, I've been doing a fair amount of angel investing since the AWS acquisition. And even then I run into founders like who sort of who have asked me to sign a check without even knowing what the product does. I don't know. It's just like, I get the fear of your ideas being stolen, but like, it's a complete non-starter for me. Like not going to invest, certainly not going to acquire a company that I don't understand what it does. So that's an easy don't. In terms of do's, some of I'll put in my investor hat again. I mean, some of the things that have worked really well recently in terms of convincing me to write a check from an angel investing perspective. One, like just having like a great deck. It's a signal that you've got your stuff together. A clean deck, nicely formatted, that you clearly put like the time and effort into. it's a leading indicator that you care about quality, you care about the details, and you're going to make sure that you hit the quality bar as ultimately you ship your product. It's not always the case. It's not always the case that like someone that can create a good investor deck is also going to ship a good product. But like I'd say those things are generally correlated. Um, I think as an investor also, I'm always interested in what's the customer feedback been. Who have you talked to? Who's either POC'd this thing, or who's actually using it now, and what is their feedback? The ones that sort of move to the front of the line are the ones that have very specific customer nuggets that they can feedback to us, saying like, oh yeah, this customer said that, or this customer is using it this way to solve that use case, and it had this effect. I've even run into some startups recently that actually have measurable impact of their effect. Like, yeah, we did a POC with this customer using our threat intelligence feed, and we identified adversary infrastructure in their environment 30 days before it showed up with VirusTotal. Like, wow, okay, that's really specific, really concrete risk reduction, which is like, honestly, that's like the holy grail of security startups, is like, if you have a way to, in a quantitative sense, prove your security value, I mean, that's the most valuable thing that you can do.
Yeah, there's a couple things come to mind. I've actually had a few other conversations like this where detail orientation has come up as a constant thread, from CISOs, from people like yourself who have also had exposure on the investing side. It just like matters and like reflects on you if you don't pay attention to the details. And as an investor and as a buyer, you're like going off of limited, incomplete information. Like you're only able to make a decision based on what you see. And if the deck doesn't look good, it's like that's what you've got to go off of.
Yeah.
And I think Bill Gurley has this amazing article on like the importance of the deck. And there was a time in venture, I think, when like it became in vogue to kind of not spend time on your deck because it signaled that like you had better things to do. There are very few founders who I think have the leverage or credibility to actually pull that off. And I think it's like a little bit of a myth that that's like looked upon positively in the ecosystem.
Yep.
So detail orientation and specificity of the value, which is a tough thing because I think founders sometimes think that they should speak in these like grandiose vision-based ways. Like we're going to do X for Y, we're going to change Z industry, we're going to disrupt this. And that's all okay as a starting point and as a frame. But if it's not grounded in like specifics and examples, it becomes very hard to actually believe.
I totally agree. One of the other sort of balancing acts that has to happen, when pitching CISOs or executives is, you always want to set up the problem, but doing it in a compelling way that's not like regurgitating information that's like very well known. Yeah, everyone knows security attacks are increasing, ransomware is increasing, but doing it with the right level of detail where it's like actually contributing a novel piece of information to the CISO. Like, I think like that's the key, is like if you get a meeting with a CISO or senior security exec in an organization, it should be thought about more as a chance to educate, even more so than selling. Like, if you can leave that CISO like, oh, I learned something new today that I didn't know, that's gonna get you the next meeting. That's gonna get you the POC probably as much as anything.
Yeah, it's funny. People ask me a lot about breaking into VC, and I tell them when you have conversations with VCs, the thing you want to do is have them walk away with new information that you've taught them.
Yeah.
it's like the best way to make a good impression is to educate and to come to the table with net new information. So one thing that you mentioned when talking about the do's is like real customer feedback, like examples of customers saying things about the product that are positive in a specific way. Another thing that we also said earlier in this conversation is that like the CISO isn't really the buyer. And I see a lot of times startups putting in their pitch deck, like, here's my CISO advisory board, here's my customer advisory board, and it's all CISOs. How does that land for you? Is that a good signal, or does that not really mean much to you?
Well,
Or does it depend? Maybe it depends.
I would say it's generally neutral. I mean, it does. Look, if this person has gotten, I'd say it's neutral to good. In that, if this person has like a deep enough network where they've been able to get these CISOs on their advisory board, well, that's a pretty good indicator that this person has a good network. And frankly, the first 10 sales that you make as a startup is going to be out of your or your investors' networks. So that's actually a good thing. Are those CISOs going to probably contribute much materially to the startup? Probably not. Are those CISOs likely now conflicted out of buying your software? Hopefully. If not, you're starting to skirt some ethical judgment territory. What I found is that from my own startup is that the most valuable advisors are the ones that are actually willing to do work for you, and that's typically not like the CISO profile. Like the advisors that we got the most value from were like sort of like these mid-career or mid-level threat hunters that were willing to like do a webinar with us, write a blog for us,
right.
And introduce us to their peer threat hunters. So like we got a lot more value from those folks than from CISOs. But look, if you're the type of founder that can recruit 4 or 5 Fortune 500 CISOs to your advisory board, go for it.
Yeah, it is interesting because we live in a world now where there's tons of mixed incentives around like getting equity in businesses and then also becoming customers of those same businesses. And it's like, how should that be interpreted? I think you ask 10 different people, you get 11 different answers. There's a lot of disagreement about that, but it is a mixed signal for sure, which I think is what you're speaking to.
Yeah, that can be like a very tricky line.
Yeah. One thing I also want to get your perspective on, which is a very tactical thing that I think founders struggle with, is around pricing. Like the basic way I feel like most seed to Series A founders price is like, let me price something that's clearly too low so I get a bunch of customers, and then like incrementally go up, or maybe like pick some number based on comps in the market that like feels right, and sort of like play by ear from there.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you learned from your journey as a founder, and you've had exposure to this since, on like the pricing side, and whether you have a perspective there.
Yeah. Look, I mean, so in terms of like your first 10 customers as a founder, I think the pricing is not that important. If you can convince people to pay you something, that's the most important thing. Really the goal there, more so I think, is to get people using your product to the point where they feel like it's indispensable. And that, more than your revenue, is what's going to demonstrate product market fit to your next round of investors. But as you begin to grow and ultimately get towards some sort of exit, pricing becomes a lot more important, because as I was mentioning, as an acquirer now, gross margins is actually really important to us.
Right.
Like, we will not acquire a company with horrible gross margins.
And
And
just for like the people viewing, founders early stage might not have a perspective on like what does horrible gross margins mean in the context of a security business.
Yeah. So define gross margins maybe first to start.
Sure. Yeah.
In general, gross margins are determined by what you're selling your software for versus the cost of goods sold. If you're like a SaaS platform, your cost of goods sold are generally going to be your cloud computing costs. So, generally speaking, as a public SaaS-based software company, security company, we aim for 80% gross margins on our platform. So if you come in with like 50% gross margins, I would consider that pretty horrible.
Yeah.
And that one will be, we'd have to come up with a detailed plan about how we're going to improve that, which might be possible because a lot of startups maybe just aren't paying attention to it. And there's a bunch of dead weight in your cogs that could be trimmed. But it's definitely a consideration. It was quite eye-opening going from, startup land where, pricing was mostly done, like you said, by looking at what competitors are doing and, sort of putting your finger in the air.
Right.
Versus, going to AWS and the level of rigor and detail that went to pricing there. Because, one of the tenets there was we don't raise prices. You got to get it right the first time. If you raise prices, you might not last at AWS very long. Mm-hmm. There's very low appetite for that. In fact, I think they would rather just, in most cases, deprecate the product and raise the pricing. So a whole different level of rigor. I mean, it's a little bit different because they have, hundreds of thousands of customers to really.
They have a little more pricing power and a little bit more data than the average startup.
Yeah. But definitely a different game.
Yeah. Cool. Eli, this has been super fun. Appreciate you coming in and taking the time with us and sharing your wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.